Hello and welcome to the Secure Synopsis of 24th May 2021. Let us get started with General Studies 1. So, right now we will be reading it out and also discussing the question and answers, unlike the previous video where I was just reading it out. Okay, let us get started. So, the first topic is General Studies 1, and the topic under it is Modern Indian History from about the middle of the 18th century until the present, significant events, personalities, and issues. The first question is assess the importance of the accounts of the Chinese and Arab travelers in the reconstructions of the history of India. So, this question is about the travelers and the reconstruction of the history of India. There is a different story if an Indian writes the history, and there is a different story if from the eyes of a Chinese and an Arab traveler, because the way they would have carried their knowledge from their home countries and the way they saw India, they would have written it in a different way. So, what importance can we have in terms of the Chinese and Arab travelers is the question. So, this was asked in the previous year paper in CSE 2018, and this falls into modern Indian history and by Spectrum Publications. There is some answers to it also. But let's have a look at the answer given here. The history of India in various epochs can be reconstructed as a result of detailed account left by foreign travelers, mainly the Chinese in ancient India and Arab travelers during medieval period. From Mauryan Empire to Vijayanagar Empire, foreign travelers have added the reconstruction of history. So there is some contribution for the Indian history in terms of the Chinese travelers, right from the Mauryan time till Vijayanagar Empire. Foreign travelers in the past played a more profound role than tourists of the present day. How is it? Because tourists of the present day, they just come, take pictures, and they just go back to their places. And if somebody wishes to write a blog, they would write a blog about that place. At the same time, when a foreign traveler in the past, when he came down to India, he used to make notes out of what he saw in India. And he used to make a detailed notes about what he saw in a kingdom, what he saw in people, how people behaved, what sort of the economic consequences people were facing, what kind of trade flourish that happened. So all these things, the foreign travelers were documenting it. But the tourists of the present day are more interested in taking pictures and storing it in their phones and not necessarily giving out a proper information about that place and not actually inquiring about what things really happened over there, right? So they were agents of the civilizational contact and exchange, bringing with them new ideas, skills, and technologies, and returning with new knowledge. You must have seen when Vasco da Gama came down to India, he carried a lot of wealth back home. So those kind of things did happen over then. They left elaborate records of their travelers, often mentioning facts that native writers simply took for granted and hence ignored, right? So, whenever you are at home, whatever is happening inside your home, you take it for granted. You feel that is not important at all. For example, a simple lemon rice or an idli that your mom makes or anything. So, you just take it for granted because you feel that it's been happening from time immemorial and it'll happen in future also. But if somebody visits your place and he tastes that food, he's definitely going to take the ingredients back home and he's going to write the entire recipe and take it back home. So that is the kind of exchange that happens when people move from one place to another. They left elaborate records of their travels, often mentioning facts that native writers simply took for granted and hence ignored. Yes, Chinese travelers visited India during the Gupta and post Gupta period, when Buddhism was prominent, while notable Arab travelers can be seen during the medieval period and the advent of the Islamic rulers. So you must have so this sentence says that it started from the Gupta period, and then you have Arab travelers in the medieval period. What is the significance of account of Chinese and Arab travelers? First and foremost, we have around five travelers, and let's start looking at each person individually. Fa Hin, the famous Chinese pilgrim. Fa Hin visited India during the reign of Chandragupta II. Okay, it's reign of Chandragupta II. Fa Hin provides valuable information on the religious, social, and economic conditions of the Gupta Empire. According to him, Buddhism was in a flourish condition in the northwestern India, but in the Gangetic Valley, it was in a state of neglect. He refers the Gangetic Valley as the land of Brahmanism. So, right, so he is mentioning some amount of casteism here, and he also talks about Buddhism and its flourishing in northwestern India, right? So we get some amount of idea about India. According to him, the economic condition of the empire was prosperous, right? We were a rich empire. His observations on social conditions are found to be exaggerated, yet his accounts are useful to know the general condition of the country. So, despite writing big words, we can get a small idea of what the country was back then. Who next comes is Huan Sang. Huan Sang was the Chinese traveler who visited India in the 7th century AD. He gave insight into social and economic life during the time of Harsha. So Fahim Chandragupta, Huansang is in the time of Harsha, H Harsha, you can remember it that way. Huansang portray the social life in times of Harsha, the fourfold division of the society, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaisya and Shudra was prevalent. So here he is talking about Brahmanism, here is talking about the fourfold division of society. Huan Sang describes the glory of the monastery with many stories built by Harsha at Nalanda. Next is Al Baruni. Al Baruni was the first Islamic chronicler. So we just read, right? Arab travelers were mostly in the medieval period. So he was the first Islamic chronicler in India and visited India along the Muhammad Ghazni. He studied Indian way of life by learning Sanskrit. That was great. He was able to understand Vedas and other sacred texts. He explains the religious condition during his visit, especially in the city of Varanasi. The Prime Minister's constituency, Al Baruni visited Varanasi also. His accounts are mentioned in the book Kitab-e-Hind. Kitab-e-Hind. He has written some of his accounts of India. Next comes Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta visited during the Tughlaq dynasty in the Sultanate period. He explains the life during Muhammad bin Tughlaq, especially the law and order of the kingdom. Okay, he even functioned as the chief Qazi during his stay in Delhi. So these days, tourists do not have any role when they visit a place, but back then, people did have an opportunity to serve in a particular kingdom. So it seems like he worked as a chief Qazi during his stay in Delhi. He also traveled across India, was able to mention the life in the deep south, especially the Pallavas. He mentions his experience in the book Rihala. He wrote a book called as Rihala. Abdur Razak, he visited the Vijayanagar kingdom, the Krishnadevaraya times, during the reign of Devaraya II of Sangama dynasty. He describes the richness of the kingdom and also revenue system of the kingdom. He describes about trade in Vijayanagara and it has been at the center of appreciation. He also describes the architecture and glory of the city of Hampni. So Abdur Razak mostly is involved in the South India. Ibn Battuta is mostly in the North India. Okay, now let's conclude it. Thus, the description of travelers plays an important role in identifying the political, economic, and social conditions of ancient time. This also helps historians to chronicle Indian history in a better way, or better organized way. So, whenever you are writing an answer, or whenever writing any article in your life, anytime in future, always make sure that you cover for a certain number of parameters, certain number of areas such as the political system, the economic system, the social system, and how those things were affecting those particular areas. Okay, that will be very easy and that will give a holistic view of a particular answer. Let's move on to the next topic, the general studies too. Topic is the effect of policies and politics of developed and developing countries on India's interests and Indian diaspora. So this is mostly involved with our international relations. Okay, now what is vaccine tourism? Why is it gaining popularity? Explain. So there was an article in Indian Express, and let's have a look at the answer given here. In India, the term vaccine tourism. So what does it mean? It is basically going from one country, from India to another country, as a visit plus as an opportunity to take a vaccine in that country because it is widely available. For example, if somebody travels from India to America, he would go there as a tourist and he would also take the vaccine over there because it is widely available and there is excess amount of vaccines. Now America is trying to export it out, whatever excess vaccines are available in that country. So this vaccine tourism can be taken in that context. So in India, the term vaccine tourism became popular late last year when reports emerged of several tour operators offering packages to the US with the additional benefit of a vaccine shot. Meanwhile, South Africans are said to be flying to Zimbabwe. Canadians and South Americans are traveling to US for jabs, while tour operators in Europe are offering trips to Russia for Sputnik 5 shots. Do you see this movement of tourism, right? So during 2020 there was lockdown and tourism was hit badly. Right now vaccine tourism can actually gain traction with these kind of packages, but how far is it going to be allowed by the country? So the world is witnessing the effects of the second wave of the COVID. While many people have lost their lives, the cases are increasing at an alarming rate. To put an end to the virus, COVID vaccine drives are taking place everywhere. Health experts and medical staff is encouraging everyone to take the jab sooner than later. While the challenge of the COVID was hovering, rare fungal infections like black fungus and white fungus have also become a cause of worry in India. At this time, another term, vaccine tourism, is gaining momentum. So, right? So instead of getting the coronavirus into your body and going to the hospital, taking admission over there and taking a lot of steroids, and then again falling sick for black fungus and yellow fungus or white fungus, the best thing is to go outside the country, take vaccine, roam around, and then get back, right? So that is kind of an idea. So the concept of vaccine tourism simply means traveling to another country for sightseeing with an included benefit of getting the jab. There are few countries that have been allowing Indians to enter considering the rising COVID cases in the country. Russia is one of the few countries that allows entry to Indians with just a negative PCR certificate and no quarantine or arrival. This has resulted in the popularity of vaccine tourism packages. Now, reasons for its popularity: the idea of vaccine tourism is gaining momentum in India. Many Indians who fled to Dubai just before international flight ban came into effect last month are said to be availing the Chinese vaccine Sinopharm's shots in the UAE. Right. In fact, vaccine tourism is an emerging trend in countries where vaccines are short in supply, where certain groups are still restricted from being inoculated. For example, in India, there is no much amount of vaccines for 18 to 45 years old. And much of the vaccine right now is for 45 plus. And if you have a look at the statistics, just about 3% of India is fully vaccinated, and about 10% of India is has received a single shot vaccine. So it becomes more of an interest for the Indians to go abroad and take a vaccine. Right. So still there are only few countries in the world, parts of US, Russia, Slovakia, Zimbabwe, that don't restrict their vaccination policy to local residents. Currently, it is not illegal to travel to a foreign country to get vaccinated if air travel is allowed. In January, Florida made it mandatory for those seeking a vaccine to produce a proof of local residency. On the other hand, the New York City recently announced a plan to use vaccine tourism to increase footfalls in the city, offering one-shot jabs to all outsiders who are from the US. Now, let's conclude it. The government of India ensures that no one has to go abroad to take the jab, as they will be able to get everyone vaccinated by the end of this year. At a time when nation is amidst huge crisis of healthcare, it would not be prudent to leave the country at this moment. Right, people with money would be, for them it's going to be very easy to move out of the country, get a vaccine, and get back to India. But what about the poor people? Already the poor people in India have been facing digital divide with less amount of internet, less amount of gadgets with them for attending online classes or for getting even a slot in the COVID app. So it's quite amusing to to allow fellow Indians who are well off to go abroad, but it is their wish. If they are getting a jab and if they want to be safe, I think the government has to allow, and it will also boost the tourism sector for the countries. So, next topic, welfare schemes for vulnerable sections of the population by the center and states, and the performance of these schemes, mechanisms, laws, institutions, and bodies constituted for the protection and betterment of these vulnerable sections. Okay, so explain in what ways the patents impediments can be avoided, ensuring social justice and improvising the battle against pandemic. So it's about patents and how patents impediments, that is patent necessities, have become a problem for manufacturing vaccines in India. Because to manufacture vaccine, there is a formula that people, the SII and the Bharat Biotech have the formula with them. But the main problem comes in the raw materials that is required to make this vaccine, and also the machinery that is needed for this vaccine. All these things are actually extremely patented, exclusively patented, and it becomes all the more very difficult for India to procure them at this point of time, because they want to ramp up their vaccination drive by giving it to different companies, the public sector companies, and we'll have to look at how India is going to do that. But before that, let's have a read about this answer. In order to achieve global herd immunity and prevent new strains of COVID-19 from emerging, possibly for years to come, vaccines need to be affordable and available in massive quantities throughout the globe. This can happen through patent owners voluntarily licensing their products to other companies, especially Indian producers who are experienced at mass producing low cost medications, right? So, patent owners should show some amount of humanity at this difficult time and voluntarily license it to those companies who are ready to manufacture vaccines, right? So ways in which patent impediments are preventing social justice. An impediment to production and distribution of vaccines is the intellectual property rights that their developers enjoy. The vaccines and other treatments have been developed to combat COVID-19, providing an unmistakable silver lining to the crisis, subject to patent protection under the trade TRIPS agreement, which means trade related intellectual property rights agreement. Right, so all these patents are under protection of these TRIPS agreement. The patent holders have the exclusive right to manufacture, sell, and use the vaccine or the drug for the entire term of patent protection of 20 years from the date of filing the patent. So, when a patent is filed, a patent owner can use it for 20 years, and if and after 20 years, it becomes a generic one, wherein everybody in the world can utilize it. Such protection could impede wider accessibility of vaccines and prolong the pandemic, right? The entire vaccination exercise and not the vaccines themselves will end the pandemic, and the challenge is to ensure that it is universalized, at least for coronavirus. The task is profound due to the increasing concerns of vaccine nationalism, whereby richer countries are procuring vaccines for their population ahead of others, which in turn could derail the goal of delivering 2 billion vaccine doses to poorer and middle income countries. So, what happens is the poor and middle income countries do not have enough money and they cannot give advance to these manufacturing companies, and US, which is the richest country in the world, easily it gives out a good amount of advances to those companies, and it procures the vaccines even before any other country can even think about procuring vaccines. So this is called as vaccine nationalism, wherein it books the vaccines while it is being manufactured. Now, what is the way forward in this context? That the joint proposal of India and South Africa at the WTO asking for a temporary waiver of the IP rights on COVID-19 vaccines and drugs needs to be understood. India and South Africa has become a champion at WTO asking for removal of these IP rights, at least for the COVID-19 vaccines. The proposal argues that IP rights could hinder the supply of vaccines and drugs at affordable prices. Now you can see SII sold to the central government for 150 rupees, and many other the states and private companies are procuring it for a higher price, and it is becoming a burden on the public exchequer. Therefore, India and South Africa, at a time when production of vaccine needs to be scaled up to meet demand, have proposed that the WTO's TRIPS Council recommend to the General Council a waiver from the implementation, application, and enforcement of certain provisions of the TRIPS agreement, waiving IP rights like patents, copyright, and trademarks for prevention, containment, or treatment of COVID-19. So it is trying to give a recommendation that there should be a waiver, and it has to be implemented and enforced in full spirit. If the waiver is granted, WTO member countries will not be under an obligation for a temporary period to either grant or enforce patents and other IP related rights to COVID-19 drugs, vaccines, and other treatments. So this will humanize the measures adopted by countries to vaccinate their populations from claims of illegality under the WTO law. Furthermore, the billions of dollars in government aid given to companies to help COVID-19 treatment should entail an obligation to enable the mass production of affordable vaccines. After all, as legal scholars have long explained, patents are not ironclad ownership rights. They are a temporary contract that balances the public interest with the claims of the innovator. Right? It is not an ironclad ownership. It is not that the person is going to carry it for life. It is temporary contract for 20 years, and if in these times of crisis they'll have to give up. What is the conclusion? This is not just a question of social justice and ensuring life-saving therapies are available to the world's poor. Waiving IP rights and compulsory licensing is a necessary step to prevent deadlier, even more contagious, and possibly vaccine-resistant variants of COVID-19 from proliferating in an under-vaccinated world. The next topic is issues relating to development and management of social sector services relating to health, education, and human resources. Let's read out the question. The barb in COVID cases and the following lockdowns has led to job losses and created an unemployment crisis. Explain with examples the initiatives taken by the governments to recompense wage losses and support livelihood. So this question is about lockdowns and how it is affecting the job losses and also has created an unemployment crisis in India. So let's have a look at the answer to this question. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, unemployment levels, definitely right. We have seen a lot of newspapers highlighting the unemployment levels in India that hit a 45-year high. Hit by a relentless COVID 19 second wave, India has seen a localized lockdowns across several states. With activity restrained, job losses have climbed. This has dampened family incomes and consumer sentiment, setting the stage for lower than anticipated economic growth and belying the nation's hopes of racing back to activity this year on a low base last year. Unemployment crisis in India. Data released by the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, a Mumbai based think tank, suggested that unemployment has again started rising in the country. The unemployment rate touched 8.6% for the week ending April 11 from just 6.7% 2 weeks ago, according to fresh data released by CMIE. With migrant laborers retreating to their native places, the impact seems to be more severe in urban areas where the unemployment rate is now reaching about 10%. We saw how people moved out from cities and they have gone to the villages during this lockdown, during this pandemic, and most of them have taken up jobs of manregas and they've taken up jobs of agriculture, and that is why you're seeing a bumper harvest happening in agriculture. So with about 73.5 lakh job losses in April, the number of employees, both salaried and non-salaried, fell from 39.8 crore in March to 39.08 crore in April for the third straight month. In April 2020, which was the first full month of lockdown, last year the unemployment rate had zoomed to 23.5%. Women tend to face a double challenge with lower labor participation and a higher unemployment rate for females compared with males for ages about 15. For the January April 2021 period, urban female LPR was 7.2% compared with urban male 64.8%, while urban female unemployment was about 18.4% against the urban male unemployment rate of 6.6%. This was given in the CMIE data show, right? Right, labor participation rate for urban female was 7.2%, whereas it was 64.8% for male, right? And the urban female unemployment was at 18.4%, but male faced very less amount of unemployment, and it is just 6.6%. And thankfully, at least somebody has to be employed in a house for to run the show, right? So the government initiatives to compensate wage loss and support livelihood, non-farm payment. The finance minister acknowledged the significance of the Manregas in providing jobs to returning workers in rural areas. Atmanirbhar Bharat as a special component from migrants. Recently, housing was to be made available from under Awas. Food security will be taken care once one nation, one ration card is implemented throughout the country. In line with the union government's advisory, about 5,000 crore released from building or other construction workers, cess fund to approximately 2 crore construction workers, the sector which is estimated to employ maximum migrant workers. Through interventions of about dedicated 20 control rooms set up by the Union Labour Ministry, stuck wages of about 300 crore released to about 2 lakh workers. The under Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana with financial package of 1.7 lakh crore, nearly 80,000 crore nearly 80 crore people have been and are being provided about free of cost 5 kg wheat or rice and 1 kg pulses, right? So this is good in terms of giving people food when their incomes have reduced. Per day wages and under Manrega enhanced from 182 to rupees 202. More days and jobs were added with an expanded budget. Swanidhi scheme launched to facilitate collateral free working capital loan up to rupees 10,000 of 1 year tenure, approximately 50 lakh street vendors to resume their businesses. Conclusion: the governments at all levels must ensure that any policy intervention must be inclusive of all and especially the most vulnerable sections of the society. The immediate concern should be to address the issue of poverty, hunger, and unemployment. A good social security scheme needs to be backed up with welfare measures for migrants, especially, right? So, and this will help truly achieve Atmanirbharta, and India would finally tread the path of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, and Sabka Vishwas. That is the logo that the Prime Minister Modi came out in the 2019 elections, and he has to help every individual in the country because there wouldn't have been that much problem had Modi not over promised. Had he promised, things would have been much better in terms of people understanding him. But right now, most of them are protesting against him. Most of them are angry on him. Whatever he does, they are picking wrongs of it. Because recently, even when he launched a scheme for the children, there was some amount of ridiculing by the public against the prime minister, saying that what about people with what about kids who are less than 18 years of age? What kind of scheme are you giving them? Whatever your schemes are, it is for 18 plus. So these kind of things has to be, taken care of. You cannot just leave it out. At least you should mention what you're going to do for those kids who are less than 18, because most of the public in India are not aware of the schemes such as orphanages and how NGOs work along with the government entities and help orphanage, because orphanage is not something new in India. There are parents who are giving up their child, abandoning their child. There are parents who take their own life on suicide and they leave their child. There are parents who meet with an accident and they are gone and leaving the child behind. So orphaning a kid is not new in India, and there are orphanages, there are child helpline, there are child welfare committees. But the government has to be very explicit in terms of its messaging, so that people don't take or don't confuse other people who are in actually need in these tough times, right? So as a civil servant aspirant, you will have to make sure that you spread enough schemes, enough knowledge about the government Modi schemes, even if you are against his way of functioning, because schemes help a common man. Hating someone is not going to take us anywhere, and rather it's going to push us even backwards. Let's move on to the next topic, GS2, government policies and intervention for development in various sectors and issues arising out of their design and implementation. The next topic is about conservation, environmental pollution, degradation, environmental and assessment. So this is mostly related to design and implementation of government policies, and also having a connection with the environment also. So Chipko was more a denunciation of everything the forest department had stood for, and less about hugging trees analyze. So this is a question that appears in India today, and the veteran environmentalist and architect of the Chipko movement, Sundarlal Bahuguna, on 94 years of age, he succumbed to the COVID-19 recently, and he is a pioneer and he's a champion when it comes to environmental consciousness, right? So let's have a look at the answer to this question. Noted environmentalist Sundarlal Bahuguna, 94, has passed away in Rishikesh. The 94-year-old Chipko movement pioneer was a Gandhian and as a Padma Vibhushan awardee. So we did not know this, that he was a Gandhian and also a Padma Bhushan awardee. The government of India has recognized him for his efforts in reforming the environment in India. Chipko movement, Sundarlal Bahuguna was a lifelong environmentalist. Who can give this commitment to a particular cause? Only few people, right? And only those people get this kind of Padma Vibhushan and they get into the newspapers. And he was credited for founding the Chipko movement, the grassroots movement that swept through the Garhwal region in the 1970s, with villagers hugging trees to stop them from being axed. So if you are an NCRT student, or if you are a CBSE student, especially from the Kendriya Vidyalayas, you would have known about the Chipko movement. Later in 1990s, he spearheaded the anti-Tehri Dam movement and even went to jail for it in 1995. The Chipko movement was a Gandhian form of protest against deforestation by locals in Himalayan region. So Chipko movement itself says that it is about hugging trees and there was no violence involved in it, and definitely it can be called as the Gandhian form. To stop deforestation, locals, primarily women, would make circles around trees and stop men from cutting them down. With the help from a local NGO, the women of the area went into the forest and formed a circle around the trees, protecting them from the men who came to cut down the trees. The women kept an all night vigil guarding their trees until all of them left. By then, the news of this movement had spread to nearby villages and more people joined in. The success achieved by this protest led to similar protests in other parts of the country. Sundarlal Bahuguna, who was leading the movement, appealed to the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi to implement a ban on cutting down the trees. His appeal resulted in a 15-year ban on chopping green trees in 1980. So to see how beautiful just a person's initiative allowed a lot of people to gather together in protecting the environment, and those people gathered people from other villages nearby for this movement, and how it became a national movement for an environmental cause, and finally getting a 15-year ban in cutting down trees. Isn't it? So you can be the change that this world needs, and you don't need another person. If you start, somebody else will definitely join you, and you are definitely not alone in this country. The movement went beyond hugging trees. The first Chipko action took place in April 1973 in Mandal village, now in Uttarakhand, and spread over the next 5 years to many Himalayan districts. The movement sparked after the government decided to allot a plot of forest area in the Alaknanda Valley to a sports goods company. So now you know if there is a sports goods company, definitely they would need wood, for example, for making bats. In 1974, the Forest Department marked trees for felling in the Peng Murenda forest near Rainy village in Joshimath block, badly affected by the massive Alaknanda flood of 1970. More than 680 hectares were auctioned for 4.7 lakh to Jagmohan Bhalla, a contractor from Rishikesh. But the women of Rainy Women drove out the contractors' laborers on March 26, 1974. So it was a women led movement. This was a turning point for Chipko as it marked the first time that the initiative by women, especially when their menfolk were not around. The Rainy incident also prompted the state government to set up a 9 member committee chaired by Delhi botanist Virendra Kumar and whose members included government officials, local MLA Govind Singh Negi of the Communist Party of India, Bhatt and Govind Singh Rawat, the block pramukh of Joshimath. The committee's report is submitted after 2 years, led to a 10-year ban on a commercial forestry in Rainy and in nearly 1,200 square kilometers of the upper catchment of the Lalaknanda. The ban was extended for 10 years in 1985. Let's conclude it. The transformation of Chipko from a struggle to control local resource use to a national movement was influenced heavily by a growing global environmental concern. Chipko began independent of global environmental consciousness, but in interacting with the rest of the world, Chipko assumed a deep conservationist bearing. In the process, its utilitarian and developmental stance was steadily eroded. General Studies 3. Let's have a look at this topic. Achievements of Indians in science and technology, indigenization of technology, and developing new technology. Okay, this is about the contributions of Indians in science and technology in India. Discuss the need and benefits of imposing eco tax as part of environmental fiscal reforms in India. Eco tax as environmental fiscal reforms. Let's have a look at this the interesting part, right? Because we have a bike, we pollute the environment, and we want a house, we construct a house, we cut the trees. So how are we going to compensate it back to the environment? The COVID-19 pandemic has forced countries all over the world to rethink climate change and the need for preservation of the environment. Fiscal reforms for managing the environment are important, and India has a great potential for revenue generation in this aspect, right? Because there's huge amount of population, and huge amount of population is creating pollution, and this pollution can be converted by into an eco tax and generate revenue from the people. Already there is huge amount of taxes on the fuel. Petrol has reached 100, so impose another environmental tax on using this fuel as part of discouraging use of vehicle use. In this context, an environmental tax is a novel idea to enforce or introduce taxes on substances which pollute the environment, the ultimate aim being the substantial reduction of pollution. The carbon tax explained. Only 13% of the world's carbon emissions come from natural sources. The other 87% come from man-made efforts. Right. So meanwhile, about 3,24,000 percent the amount of fossil fuel derived carbon dioxide has increased by about 3,24,000% since 1751, resulting in accelerated global warming. That is huge. You can see this infographic where you have pandas, penguins actually holding help as it. And then you have Australia's carbon tax aims to cut at least 159 million tons of carbon pollution per year by 2020, the equivalent of taking 45 million cars off the road. Right. So this year, about 300 of the country's biggest polluters will pay 23 per ton dollars of carbon created. In Europe, it's as low as about $9 per ton. This will cost, this will cost Qantas about 115 million dollars, and passengers will absorb a 3.5 dollar increase per sector on their flights because of this tax. So 50% of all revenue collected will be given back to the households to offset the increase in living costs, and $10 billion over 5 years will be invested into clean energy. This is a very good initiative, but let's see the benefits and the other things of this. Eco tax objective and purpose. The aim and purpose of environmental tax is to curb or reduce the extent and amount of use of consumption of harmful substances or activities or depletion of a resource. Environmental tax reforms generally involve three complementary activities: eliminating existing subsidies and taxes that have a harmful impact on the environment, and restructuring existing taxes in an environmentally supportive manner, initiating new environmental taxes. These are some of the measures. Taxes can be designed either as revenue neutral or revenue augmenting. In case of revenue augmenting, the additional revenue can either be targeted towards the provision of environmental goods or directed towards the overall revenue pool. In developing countries like India, the revenue can be used to a greater extent for the provision of environmental public goods and addressing environmental health issues. Benefits of an eco tax in India. The implementation of an environmental tax in India will have three broad benefits. First is fiscal, environmental, and then you have the poverty reduction. Environmental tax reforms can mobilize revenues to finance basic public services, right? When raising revenue through other sources proves to be a difficult or burdensome. Revenue from environmental tax reforms can also be used to reduce other distorting taxes such as fiscal dividend. Environmental tax reforms help internalize the externalities, and the said revenue can finance research and the development of new technologies. Environmental regulations may have significant costs on the private sector in the form of slow productivity growth and high cost of compliance, resulting in the possible increase in the prices of goods and services, which again will affect the consumer in the end. However, the European experience shows the most of the taxes also generate substantial revenue, and there is no evidence on green taxes with sustainable development goals leading to a no growth economy. Most countries' experience suggest a negligible impact on the GDP, though such revenues have not necessarily been used for environmental considerations. Let's conclude it. Green taxes shall have a deterrent effect, sensitizing the citizens about pollution control and management. The eco tax rate may thus be fixed commensurate to the marginal social cost so evaluated. Hence, this is the right time for India to adopt environmental fiscal reforms. But I would not suggest it to be taxed on the people. Rather, the companies have to pay when they are making huge amount of pollution. Um, in the environment, because right now people are already paying huge amount of taxes as part of fuel tax. Next is science and technology developments and their application and effects in everyday life. Science and technology's development and their application effects in everyday life. What is meant by genome sequencing? In the context of COVID-19 pandemic, analyze its significance in the health sector. How can we sequence the genome and reduce the number of diseases? And how can we fight the diseases by sequencing it? Okay, let's have a look at it. Genome sequencing refers to the method through which the order of DNA nucleotides or bases in a genome, the order of A, S, C, S, G, S, and T, S, A's, C's, G's, and T's that make up an organism's DNA are figured. The human genome is made up of all of over 3 billion of these genetic letters, that is A, C, G, and T. A genome is complete genetic material of an organism. It is like an instruction manual which contains information about the makeup of the organism. While human genomes are made of DNA, the deoxyribonucleic acid, a virus genome can be made either of a DNA or an RNA. DNA and RNA provide genetic instructions for growth and functioning of organisms. For example, when you buy an Apple phone, you will have a manual with it. So that kind of manual is called as DNA. Coronavirus is made of RNA. Genome sequencing is a technique that reads and interprets genetic information found within DNA or RNA. Now, what's the significance of SARS-CoV-2 genome sequencing? The purpose of genome sequencing is to understand the role of certain mutations in increasing the virus's ineffectivity. Some mutations have also been linked to immune escape or the virus's ability to evade antibodies, and this has consequences for vaccines. As we know well, the virus undergoes mutation as they replicate. Mutation are tiny errors in the genetic code that occur during the duplication process. While some are harmless, others can bring about such changes in the virus that can make it more transmissible or deadly. So it is important to keep a track of the genome sequencing in order to check the virulence of the virus. So as the number of differences between viral strains increase, it's likely that the resulting viruses will also have behave differently in terms of how fast it spreads, the kind of symptoms and the intensity of the disease it causes. The differences can be beneficial, harmful, or inconsequential. Different variants can have different tendencies and may need new containment and treatment strategies. The foreign variants identified were primarily the B117, first identified in the United Kingdom, and B1351, first found in South Africa, and a small number of P2 variants from Brazil. However, some labs flagged the growing presence of variants identified in India that were clubbed into a family of interrelated variants called B1617, also known as the double mutant variant, primarily due to the two mutations E484Q and L452R on the spike protein. Only genome sequencing can identify various mutations, which further will help in vaccine development and testing. Genome sequencing helps scientists find the exact location in the virus where a mutation has taken place. If the mutation happens in significant proteins of the virus, like the spike proteins, which helps it to infect the human cell, then the virus is likely to spread at a faster speed. Conclusion: WHO asserted that more than the virus spreads, higher are chances of mutations and new strains to come up. So it is important to vaccinate a critical mass of people to break the chain of transmission as soon as possible. Until then, it is essential to follow preventive measures like social distancing, hand hygiene, wearing masks, and taking the vaccine to avoid infections.